I am not leading this fight as a matter of aesthetic pleasure. I am leading because somebody must lead, or else the fight would not be made at all.
Theodore Roosevelt, the 26th President of the United States, running again for that job in 1912 as the Bull Moose candidate. Now, TR has a complicated legacy. To some, he was the ultimate American patriot and hero, but others remember him as the trust buster who split from the Republican Party. So, who was the real Theodore Roosevelt? Let's discuss it. For more, we're pleased to be joined by Daniel Ruddy. Daniel is the author of a brand new book, Theodore the Great, Conservative Crusader. Dan, it is so good to have you here on Newsmax Prime, and I promise we're going to get to the book. But first, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about an article with your byline that appears at Newsmax.com. It's entitled, Theodore the Great, How Trump Channels Teddy. There's an excerpt from your book. You write that Trump and Roosevelt are as different as night and day, but they also overlap in notable ways, especially in their populist appeal and nationalist world view. Care to elaborate?
Yeah, sure. Well, first, JD, thanks for having me here. It's really a great honor to be on Newsmax and to talk about my new book about Teddy Roosevelt. Trump and Teddy it's interesting because they're both brash New Yorkers, very outspoken. They're very similar in many respects. Teddy in 1912 ran against the establishment of the Republican Party, and of course Trump did that this year. And so in that sense they're very similar, but they're very different also in their in the sense that Teddy was a Victorian moralist and sort of very uptight by the standards of our generation. So I don't think he would approve of some of Trump's language, which some consider coarse and vulgar. I think Teddy would think that. But they're very similar in the sense that they're both populists and both nationalists. Teddy Roosevelt, you can't get more of a over-the-top patriot than him in terms of American history. So differences and similarities. But on the whole, I think if Teddy were alive today, if we could bring him back to life, I don't think he would approve of Trump on the whole.
Well, let's break it down with some policies. For example, Mr. Trump is getting criticism in some quarters for his views on immigration, especially that key proposal that really separated himself from the rest of the Republican field when he suggested a ban on Muslims entering the country as immigrants. In fact, let's take a listen to what Mr. Trump said earlier this year.
When I'm elected, I will suspend immigration from areas of the world where there is a proven history of terrorism against the United States, Europe, or our allies, until we fully understand how to end these threats.
Now, that was a bit of a modification from his earlier statement, but I'm just kind of interested. Where do you think TR would line up, given his extreme nationalist feelings? Would he line up with Trump on this?
I think in many respects he would. Theodore Roosevelt was for immigration, but as I describe in my book, he wanted the right kind of immigrants to come to the United States. He really hated this idea of people from foreign nations coming to the United States and then maintaining their allegiance to their country of origin. He called them, well, he denounced them as hyphenated Americans.
Right, I remember that writing, and he said there is no place for hyphenated Americanism.
Exactly, and so for that reason, I think he would be sympathetic to what Trump is saying. On the other hand, Teddy was more inclusive in terms of religions. He wanted to have a very balanced administration, for instance. He was the first American president to appoint a Jewish American to his cabinet, Oscar Strauss. He loved to talk about the fact that he supported both Catholics and Protestants. For instance, he went during his trip overseas in 1910, he visited Italy, and there was a great controversy because he made it a point he wanted to visit both Protestant and Catholics, so his appointment was actually canceled with the Pope because the Vatican did not approve of him meeting with some Methodists. He wanted to have a balanced approach. So Trump, I think, with his Muslim ban, banning people based on their religion, I think Teddy would be more inclusive than that. But I think he would be open to the idea of banning immigrants from certain countries.
So the modification that Trump makes is more Teddy-centric.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, let's talk more about the book.
Okay.
And Theodore the Great, Conservative Crusader. Right there, the title, because it has become in vogue to say that that TR was a progressive. He was actually like Woodrow Wilson. You have a very different view.
Yeah, exactly, and that's why the book was written, really, because most people don't realize this, but over the last 10 years or so, Teddy's reputation has really been under intense assault from people on the right, not people on the left. People on the left have embraced him. So I'm talking about people like Glenn Beck, people like Jonah Goldberg, George Will, Judge Napolitano. They've all excoriated Teddy as what they describe as a sinister progressive. And a lot of the problem has to do with this word progressive. It's a semantic issue. Teddy ran as the first progressive candidate leading the Progressive Party in 1912 for the White House. But that word means something very different today than it did then. If you believe Glenn Beck, George Will, and so forth, they make it seem that Teddy Roosevelt is equivalent to President Obama or Nancy Pelosi. And nothing could be further from the truth. Teddy Roosevelt, at his core, was a deeply conservative man who was sensible enough to listen to the American people and then to implement reforms based on what the country was saying. I mean, that's what any responsible president should do.
Well, let me ask the question that comes up, because we're seeing the never-Trumpers leaving the Republican Party, and I understand the equation is a bit different when you have a former president leading an independent effort or a third-party effort, as TR did with the Progressives against William Howard Taft. But when he made that decision, in retrospect, did he just leave the White House too early as our youngest president in history? Was it more of a personal decision than a policy decision to run again in 1912?
Yes, that's part of the issue. He was so young when he left the White House. He wasn't even 50 years old yet. So he had so much energy, so much going on, that he wasn't one to sit at home in quiet retirement like Thomas Jefferson did, retiring to Monticello. So, that was part of the issue. But the 1912 is really the reason, I think, why he's misunderstood. Because people think that he was pursuing this radical left agenda when he really wasn't. I really recommend to anyone interested in this to just go online and read the Progressive Party platform of 1912. Just read it. I elaborate on it in my book. The things that he's proposing are just really common sense things. Things like labor law, child labor laws, the 8-hour workday, workman's compensation. He also wanted to build 2 battleships every year. I mean, you wouldn't find that, that kind of strengthening of the military in a far left. Jane Addams, who was a leftist activist at that time, she was against that proposal, as many on the left were, about building up the military. But the whole idea of those reforms, most of them are now law. You read that and you think, boy, this is a far-sighted statesman. This isn't some radical leftist.
So, in other words, what became commonsensical in the 20th century was championed first by Theodore Roosevelt.
Exactly. And there wasn't anything sinister about it. He wasn't twisting his mustache thinking, I'm going to create this nanny state to control the lives of Americans and tax and regulate them to death. That wasn't the case at all.
And we can read more about it right here in this great book,
yes.
Theodore the Great, Conservative Crusader. A necessary revisionist account by Daniel Ruddy. And Dan, we very much appreciate your time here on Newsmax.
Thanks so much for having me, JT.
For those you see and those you don't, stay brave, stay free, stay tuned.